Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
England's Football Association is outdated, held back by, quote, elderly white men, and unable to counter the power of the Premier League, say 5 former executives of the governing body. David Bernstein, David Davis, Greg Dyke, Alex Horne and David Treisman say the FA has failed to self-reform, and they describe its decision-making structures as arcane and convoluted. We'll speak to 2 of those men who've written to MPs calling for reform in a moment. But of course, today's criticism of the FA comes at a time when it's already under intense pressure over the way it's handled historic allegations of sexual abuse in football. A story which has unfolded on this programme over the last few weeks and months.
The impact it's had on my life is just catastrophic, and you live with that all your life, and I can't put it into words what that has done to me.
This has not been easy for me to do, but I felt that I needed to do this so that other people will come out.
Hello, you're through to the NSPCC Whistleblowing Advice Line. You're speaking to Sheila. Are you calling with concerns for a child?
And then he invited you. Did you ever consider telling?
Both my parents have died, and that hurts me.
Yeah.
Not telling them.
Does it?
Yeah. But I don't know if it's a good thing that I did or I didn't tell them, because they would have blamed themselves. So.
What we've got to do is to make sure that those victims are supported, that this doesn't turn into an exercise by football trying to protect its own reputation.
There's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt attached, a lot of confusion. And like I say, it was just impossible at that time to come out, just impossible.
Everyone was kind of just naked and getting thrown on this bed, and a very quick massage, and it was uncomfortable. It's very wrong for a start.
Because I was tired, because I obviously had to be back for school. So just sort of lay your head in my lap, and he was be stroking my head, and I just that was when I start things, you know, that was odd to me. This was happening.
When you signed that confidentiality agreement, what were you thinking when they wanted you to keep quiet about it, about the abuse you'd suffered?
With the document, I was basically pushed into a corner, and it was basically, there's the money, but to have the money, you have to sign this.
OK, let's speak now to David Bernstein, who was FA chairman from 2011 to 2013, and also to Greg Dyke, who replaced him as chairman from 2013 to earlier this year. They've both written to MPs calling for reform of the FA. Let's talk to both of them. Mr Bernstein, what do you want to see change?
Well, first of all, can I say this is something that I've been speaking about for 3 or 4 years. This is not something that's just arisen. I think Greg, he'll speak for himself, but I know he agrees, and David Treesman, all independently, and we are very independent on this matter, of the same view, that the FA basically is antiquated, out of date, and not sufficiently independent. So what I want to see, and I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, I'd like to see, and the Parliamentary Select Committee has said the same thing, changes to the FA shareholder base, which I could explain, the FA Council, the FA Board, the FA committees. And I'd like to add something else perhaps a bit later on. I'd like to see the direction of travel for money that goes from the Premier League, actually not to go directly from the Premier League to the rest of the game, but from the Premier League to the FA, to a reformed FA, because I believe that would remove part of the Premier League soft power that it has and exercises very well, and would reinforce the power of the FA. We need an FA that can bring better balance back into the English game.
And why didn't you do this when you were chairman?
Well, as my predecessor or successor found out, it was basically impossible. I did what I could. I did bring in some reform. I managed to get 2 independent directors onto the board, including a woman, which was quite an achievement, I think. But beyond that, it was impossible. The structure is resistant to change, and that's been made clear, I think, by the Select Committee's initial report, which remember goes back 4 or 5 years, and from the letter they've just released.
Greg Dyke, you left the FA earlier this year, again after trying to change things and failing. All 5 of you would have fought against being subject to legislation when you led the organisation. Is it not hypocritical for you to call for legislation now?
I'm not sure I would have fought against legislation. What I said was, let's try and reform this place before the legislators have to do it. And in truth, I failed. I couldn't get them to agree. This sort of arcane system wants to carry on as it is. And I think what this letter is really saying to the Select Committee and to government is, look, if you want change, you're going to have to do it, because this organisation will not reform itself. It's in desperate need of reform, and it won't do it. Therefore, don't do any more reports saying we want this and we want that, and not do anything about them. In my time as chairman, 2 ministers of sport, not the current minister of sport, but 2 ministers of sport said to me, you know, if you don't change, we're going to change you. And I said, yeah, but nobody believes you. And unless you give it some teeth, unless you actually start to do it, they don't believe you, so therefore they're never going to reform.
Right. Why do you say it is in desperate need of reform?
Oh, because then, well, I invite you to go along to a meeting of the FA Council, because it's like stepping back into the 1940s. I mean, it's 120 people, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male.
Okay, so they're not representative of greater society. That doesn't tell us.
Well, they're not representative of football, but what they do is they fight to retain what is, because what is suits them. And in no organisation does that make sense. You've obviously, in any organisation, you've got to have a structure and a system which embraces change. But then you come on from the council to the board, and the board, as my predecessor just said, the board has a majority from either the national game, you know, from grassroots football, or from the professional side, and they together join up. They join up to make sure that anything that we wanted to do, that the reformers wanted to do, was stopped. And therefore, it doesn't make sense. And what we're saying to Damien Collins, and I think he's going to come on your programme, and I hope what he'll say is he is now going to take some action and press the government then the FA might begin to reform itself. But at the moment, there's no chance.
OK, we will, as you say, we will talk to Mr Collins in just a moment. I want to move on to historic sexual abuse in football, if I may. Also an FA governance issue, the issue of our time, if I may put it like that. Mr Bernstein, you were chairman of Manchester City from 1994 to 2003. You were chairman of the FA from 2011 to 2013. Did the issue of sexual abuse in football ever cross your desk whilst you were in either role?
No, it didn't. It really didn't. And I must tell you, if it had done, I would have taken it up and dealt with it. I commend what you've done, Victoria, on this subject. It's awful, and I think this matter is under investigation now. I hope the investigations are strong enough and independent enough.
Okay, well, let me ask the same question to Mr. Dyke.
Sorry.
Go on.
Sorry, but what I would say is that if an organisation is modern, cutting edge, and sort of with modern society, is more likely to react to things like this positively and less likely to sort of sweep them under the carpet. Now, we'll see what comes out of these investigations, but this and many other issues going back over decades, I believe would have been treated more efficiently and in a more sympathetic way had the organisations been themselves modernised.
Right. Mr. Dyke, Mr. Bernstein never heard anything about allegations of abuse. What about you when you were in the top job at the FA?
I have to say, in the 3 years I was chairman, it never crossed my desk. What did cross my desk was our processes. Were our processes working and being effective? But they were about today. I suspect, most of the complaints I've heard so far, most of the cases are historic cases. They're not modern cases. And I think the FA staff have run quite an effective system in recent years, but hopefully what they've now set up an investigation looks first of all at how effective is the existing system, and could that be improved, because clearly that's the major priority before getting back into historic cases.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point that some of the cases are historical, some of them are. I just put it to you again, you know, we now know nearly 100 clubs have been named, over 80 alleged abusers. Is it really feasible? Is this what you're telling our audience? Really feasible that the people at the top knew nothing?
Well, you've got to
absolutely. Sorry, I mean, I assure you that was the case, and you know these questions need to be addressed to many others as well, to the Premier League, to the Football League, and also to the PFA. I mean, the PFA is the players' union, and you would have thought that would be the first port of call that players would go to if they're in trouble. And I'm fascinated to know how over 20 or 30 years the PFA never seemed to know about these things or react to these things. That would be the first port of call, I would have thought.
Mr. Dyke?
Well, and of course the clubs, I mean, they are the employer. The clubs are the employer, they employ these people. But I, as I say, certainly in my 3 years, this did not cross my desk, unless it's referred up to you as the chairman. You're not likely to discover it for yourself, unless someone writes to you. I certainly had nobody ever wrote to me in that situation.
Okay. I mean, again, it may not have crossed your desk, Mr. Dyke. In the time when you were chairman, Barnsley have confirmed that they hired an academy physio without doing all the criminal record checks on him. So that, you know, in your time as boss, that was happening.
But we are not in charge of Barnsley.
No, I know, but you were the top man running the FA.
Sure, but the FA is in charge. That's what I'm saying. What is interesting to me seems to be, first of all, you need an urgent check, which I think is what the FA are doing, on the processes that exist now and how effective they are. On the second case, you then got to get into the historic cases. But I can only tell you what happened. It didn't come. But as the chairman of the FA, I really wouldn't know that Barnsley would have employed someone who hadn't passed the checks.
Yeah, fair enough. And actually, I've made a mistake. It was in Mr. Bernstein's time as FA boss. I do apologise, Mr. Dyke.
Well, the same answer applies, Victoria.
It wouldn't have been. Those sorts of decisions are not referred up to the. Now there should be a checking system.
Yeah.
And I mean, know how effective is it. Let's not kid ourselves, though, that whatever you do, you're going to avoid this happening on odd occasions. What you want to know is it's not a systematic process. It's not systematically happened as it seems to have been pre the 90s.
Gagging clauses.
Victoria, coming back to the. Sorry, Mayor? I mean, coming back to the core issue here, which is FA structure and governance, if you had an FA council, an FA board, an FA shareholder base, all modernised and geared and more receptive to these things, there's much more likelihood that the whole atmosphere within the Football Association and within football generally would be to take these things on board, and maybe there'd be less reluctance for them to be reported further up the thing. I mean, Greg is absolutely right. He and I certainly, and he, I'm sure, never had these things put on our desks. And believe me, I think we're both strong enough in personalities that if we had done, we would have reacted to them.
I'm just going to, this email from Philippa, will nobody in FA management take responsibility? I do not believe these two guests when they say they did not know anything about the abuse. It's not credible.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Can't do much about that. The answer is it was not. It did not refer. And I mean, you also should need to look at the position of the media and everybody else involved in this, because actually, Channel 4 did do dispatches back in the 90s on this, and no one else followed it up. I mean, this isn't only the FA. This is a societal thing of that time. As I say, what is absolutely essential to know is, are the systems today effective?
Gagging clauses, which I think was in your time as FA chairman, Mr. Dyke. Did Chelsea break FA rules in your mind?
No, I'm not there now, so I don't know what happened. I haven't seen a report. I've only, seen what's happened. What I do know is a lot of organisations, when they've been given these sorts of issues, have not accepted liability, but have paid compensation on the basis of a gagging clause. And that doesn't only happen in, the BBC does it, which I know intimately. It doesn't mean to say you accept guilt. It means you accept that there's a case and you wish to end the case.
David Bernstein, could you see a situation where a case involving sexual abuse could be subject to a gagging clause?
I don't know the answer. Sorry, Victoria, I don't know the answer to that. It's something I can't answer. I don't know.
Yeah. Should clubs face some sort of sanction if they're found to use them?
Well, I don't know. Neither, I think, David or I are in a position to know that. We haven't seen all the details. But in the end, the clubs are the employer, not the FA.
Okay.
And in the end, it's the employer who has the responsibility.
Could we go
back to the wider thing? You see, what I think is that there is no effective regulation in football. And I think you're only going to get effective regulation if either the FA becomes more independent or you have an outside regulator.
Okay.
Because, if you look at the Premier League, the Premier League is 20 clubs, 20 what are now big businesses, coming together to sell their rights together in a cartel. If you did that in any other industry, people would laugh at it. It actually is quite effective in football, but you can only do it, therefore, if you have an effective regulator as well, because it is a cartel.
OK, well, I'm sure the Premier League would reject that. Damien Collins, you're the Conservative MP who has received this letter from the 5 former bosses of the FA. You're also chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. First of all, the Premier League, accused by Greg Dyke there of operating like a cartel. What's your view?
Well, the former chairman are right that the Premier League is incredibly commercially powerful and works very strongly for the interest of its member clubs. But the issue with English football is, as Greg Dyke has said, there is no effective regulator for English football. The FA does not have the power to say, well, there's an issue we're going to resolve, we're not happy with it. It doesn't matter whether this is a Premier League issue or a conference issue. We are the governing body and we ultimately have the final say.
So would you back an external regulator?
Well, I think the FA should be the regulator for English football. It should be the governing body. It should have the powers and the independence to regulate the whole of the game.
OK, but it doesn't have that. So would you back an external force or not?
Well, no, what I'm proposing in response to the letter that we've received from David Bernstein and Greg Dyke and the other former officials is that we restructure the Football Association using legislation to do it in line with the recommendations previously made by Select Committee reports. What that would do is give the Chief Executive and the Chairman of the FA, along with independent non-executive directors, a majority on the board, so they could outvote the vested interests of the Premier League or the national game representatives and do what they think is in the best interest of football and behave like a proper governing body.
And in practical terms, how would that work? You talk about legislation. Give us more detail.
Yes, so what I've asked the clerks in Parliament to do is produce a draft bill which will publish in the new year, and it's possible to create a bill which can legislate to change the rules of a private organisation like the Football Association. So Parliament could pass a bill that would externally reform the constitution of the FA, and then we would leave it to the FA to get on to use these new powers to be an effective regulator for the game.
Is it, right now, is the FA a stagnant old boys club?
Well, yes, it doesn't represent the modern game. It doesn't represent the people that play the game today, and it is not effective at dealing with the challenges that face football today. And I think that's why it needs to be totally reformed, and I think legislation is the only way it can be done. I think what is really significant about the letter we've received, I mean, David Bernstein, Greg Dyke, David Treisman, Alex Horne, David Davis, they've all appeared in front of the Select Committee, they've all been asked about reform, they've all done their best to try and achieve reform. Here we have senior figures from the football family saying it cannot be done without legislation to drive through the change. And I feel we've debated this enough, so we should get on and do it.
Two more quick questions. When you spoke to us a couple of weeks ago, you told us that you were concerned that the FA's internal inquiry into allegations of sexual abuse in football was being run by a QC who'd worked with the FA previously, and you worried about her independence. You also worried about whether they were going to publish the findings of their review. They've now changed the QC. They now say they're committed to publishing it. Are you happy?
Yes, I am. I think the scope of the inquiry it's much better set up now. It's much broader. It's got the power to go into the clubs and investigate what went wrong in the clubs, which is crucial. What I've said to the FA is that in terms of publication, the only grounds for not publishing anything within the report should be the recommendation of the police that doing so may compromise an open investigation. The FA shouldn't have the power to block any of it just on policy grounds or because football may be embarrassed. This has to be completely transparent. I think by having a properly published report and a proper debate about it, we can do what Greg Dyke said, which is check it and make sure the current safeguarding arrangements are adequate based on what we know failed in the past.
Should the Scottish FA launch their own inquiry into allegations of historic sexual abuse?
I think they should. I think given the evidence that's come out so far, that there are issues in Scotland too. I think they should do the same. I think all national governing bodies of sport should also be having a serious look, at their own sport, because I don't believe this is purely a football problem. It probably affected other sports too. Football is just such a popular game that it's likely to involve more cases, but I think there could be safeguarding issues elsewhere as well. I'm not seeing any evidence of that, but I think all sports should take this seriously.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Damien Collins, Head of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. Thank you very much, Mr Bernstein. And Mr Dyke, thanks for coming on the programme. Appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all my